All right, guys. We're moving on to chapter 11. Um, and honestly, this chapter is a bit of a hodgepodge. Tries to cover uh, a large period of time for five different civilizations. So we're going to be like skipping across the surface of a lot of things here. Um, it starts off talking about China. So after the fall of the Han in 220, um, China entered a bit of an uneasy period for a long time. One of the things that we do see during this time is kind of this blend that comes up between Confucianism and Buddhism as Buddhism continues to spread. Um, Confucianism is very much based on a social order, right? The family, the relatives, the obligation to society. Buddhism is more inner, okay? So it's about finding enlightenment and reaching nirvana. And out of this, and out of also the traditional Taoist beliefs, there comes this interesting balance between all three: the obligation to the self to find nirvana and to move towards a higher something higher, and at the same time how that spreads out and impacts society, and how you have obligations and are part of something larger than yourself. So this is taking place during this time. Um, the Tang Dynasty in 618, the Tang Dynasty kind of starts bringing things back together. After about 400 years of warring tribes and people spread out and not really consolidated, we see under the Tang a bit of a reunification. Um, so the Tang Dynasty was the largest and most organized government in the entire world for several hundred years. The capital was at the end of the Silk Road, which we've talked about already, Chang'an, the city of enduring peace. Um, and by the 8th century, this was a city of 1 million people living inside a wall that was 26 miles going around and enclosing about 42 square miles inside. This was a massive, massive city. Um, and it was also a very diverse city. People who were Korean, Jewish, Christian, I think they had Filipinos. I mean, it was a very uh, diverse population. They conducted diplomatic relations, as far west as Persia. I mean, this was a city that was probably unparalleled in the history of the world. I mean, very genuinely. Um, One of the most important things they did was they built the Grand Canal, bringing water from the Yellow River uh, into the city, uniting northern and southern China. They developed iron and steel casting in the third century, and it became commonplace by the sixth or seventh century to use it. So um, they built suspension bridges and pagodas using these techniques. The West didn't get these same techniques for another 1,500 years, almost. It's China was so far ahead of anything going on in the West at this point in so many ways. Um, let's see here. The Chinese often use the minqi or articles of the spirit for the ancestors. They would put these things in with them, and of course, with the idea that these would be things to go with them into the spirit world. Um, the Tang were very much equestrians. They were horse riders, and if you look there on page 378, you can see just the beautiful, beautiful techniques of the time for making these sculptures. They were three color to produce yellows, browns, green for oxide, or oxide to create green, and cobalt oxide for some deep dark blues, and just created some beautiful, beautiful pieces. The Tang first and foremost valued education. Education was crucial, and they spent you would spend your whole life learning the arts, learning poetry, learning law, The Book of Songs, of course, was very important, connected. We talked about this when we talked about the Zhao dynasty. Um, Li Bai, one of the poets of the time, was famous for self-examination, um, using colloquial language, which means colloquial meaning the common language, right? That would be like using a poem that says y'all in the poem as opposed to you. Um, so he would use the vernacular. Um, and he talked a lot about sensuality and sexuality, and it was part of just part of the way he spoke. Um, China, we would come in Western culture. We have what's called the Renaissance man, and the Renaissance man is somebody who is good at a lot of things. He is chivalrous. He understands how to speak. He understands how to sing. He knows how to dance. He can compose. He can fight. Um, it's a well-rounded person. Okay, um, and this was something that was valued during the Renaissance. They, the Chinese came to this centuries before the West did, as far as an ideal, um, focusing on poetry, calligraphy, art, philosophy, statesmanship. Okay, um, in as this as the Tang fell and the Song dynasty arose, and the Hangzhou was their capital. The world's largest city at that point. We're talking during the era of Marco Polo, right? This is the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279. Um, Hangzhou even larger, about 2 million people in it, and Marco Polo was the first Westerner to see the city. Um, he was an ambassador for Kublai Khan, uh, and the northern part of China had already fallen to Kublai Khan in 1271, and it wasn't for another 8 years that that he crossed the Yangtze River and would conquer southern China. Um, the Hangzhou was just again an incredible city. Pagodas, temples, palaces. There were 12,000 bridges crisscrossing the city over canals. I mean, uh, 12 different guilds. Each guild, as Marco Polo would say, 12,000 houses in the occupation of its workmen, containing at least 12 men, while some contain up to 20 to 40, and all of them fully employed. Okay, no unemployment. This is a city with people that was enormous, but everybody had something to do, to put their hand to, and to work. Um, the citizens were accustomed to delicate work, and this perhaps their downfall, because Kublai Khan was an invader, a man of war, and the people, despite how many there were, they were not really as a as a city, as a nation, were not exceptionally warlike. They lived in luxury, and the thought of somebody destroying such beauty was often beyond people. Why would you destroy something so beautiful and so perfect? It seemed ridiculous, and it is. Um, they were at the time they were the greatest producer of iron. Um, they had a merchant class traveling along the Silk Road and through Southeast Asia. The government was controlled increasingly by the merchants. As the merchants got more and more wealth, obviously with wealth comes power. Um, they also had movable type well before the West had its printing press, and that of course leads to greater knowledge because more people you're able to mass produce knowledge in the form of books, and then in turn more people were able to read. Um, the This new educated government officials put Confucianism back into dominance, as with its not in of itself, but with the contributions of Taoism and Buddhism. Okay, so these three become, in many ways, inseparable as they bleed into each other with their various traditions. Um, 1279 to 1368 is the Yuan dynasty, falling to Kublai Khan, the Mongol. Okay, and he created Beijing, which is the present capital of China. Okay, creating the walled city on a grid plan and extending the Grand Canal all the way to, excuse me, to Beijing. They control, while the Yuans and Kublai Khan's descendants controlled the highest posts in government, they were very dependent upon the native Chinese for the government posts, not the highest posts, but the ones underneath them to keep things functioning. And the Chinese were very, very good at that. There became an underground movement against the Yuan, as in any culture that has been oppressed. There become symbols for it. The primary symbol for this rebellion was the bamboo, because bamboo bends, but it doesn't break, and eventually it's going to snap back and hurt you. And so you would see a lot of paintings of bamboo. A common enough thing, but it had added significance. And then in 1368, the Yuan were overthrown by Zhu Xuanzang, who drove the last Yuan emperor out of the country north into the Gobi Desert, and created the Ming Dynasty. Okay, moving from China into India. Buddhism had waned in influence from about 100 to 600, and then, of course, as Islam spread, that further weakened Buddhism in India. Hinduism became increasingly popular, especially because they believe in so many gods. It allowed the incorporation of other beliefs into it without really contradicting it. And India, into the 14 and 1500s, was ruled by Hindi rulers, especially in the south. The Buddhist monks in Nepal and the Himalayas kind of blended Buddhism with the native religion known as Bon, which their leaders were called lamas, which means none superior. And of course, you've heard of the Dalai Lama, I'm sure, who is the greatest of the lamas. So none superior to none. Dali meaning ocean. And this is supposed to be a reincarnation. Once the Dalai Lama dies, then they search out the child who is his reincarnation. In 1044, Anaratha, the first king of the Bagan Empire, was an devout Buddhist, and his capital became this hub for learning of the Buddhist religion, attracting monks from all over Asia. He built the Sunset Pagoda, and for the next 2 centuries, his heirs built more than 13,000 temples, pagodas, and other religious structures. And there's still about 2,000 of them around. And then, of course, Kublai Khan took out that dynasty as well. One of the things that we see within the Hindu religion is the Hindu religion has a great respect and admiration for sexuality, and that is worked into their architecture, in the shapes and the forms, in the art that goes into it. You look, for example, at Angkor Wat 387, right? You have a very phallic-appearing structure. And then we look at the relief sculpture there on 387 of the Devatas, the guardian spirits who seduce mortals. Okay. All right. Japan. Like I said, we're skipping over a lot of things really fast. During the Buddhism was known in Japan before the Yamamoto period, but it it was really came into its own during this time, about 700. And in Yamamoto, Japan, the Soga, the Minobi, and the Nakatomi, uh, Nakatomi, I should be able to say, I have seen Die Hard. The Nakatomi all were vying for power through marriage to the emperor. The Mononobe were in charge of the military, the Nakatomi in charge of Shinto ritual, and the Soga were the managers of the imperial estates. And they were often in contact with the Koreans and the Chinese and brought a lot over from them. As the Soga gained more and more power over the last part of the 6th century, eventually defeating their rivals. The head of the Soga clan installed his daughter as empress and crowned her nephew as regent and crown prince. The capital was moved inland from Osaka to the Soga household in the Asuka Valley. And the crown prince, Shotoku, whose name actually means wise and virtuous, emphasized the importance of the Chinese models of civil government and of this very formal system of administration, and also introduced the concepts of Confucianism to the court. He ended up constructing a Buddhist temple as well, but only the aristocracy really pursued Buddhism. In 645, okay, about 50 years after this, the Nakatomi had been forced to tolerate Buddhism, even as they continued to maintain the traditional Japanese Shinto religion, rebelled, and they killed most of the Sogas. And anybody who tried to fight back as well, anybody who showed the least amount of resistance was killed. So Nakatomi no Kamatari was awarded Fujiwara Emperor by Emperor Tenji for his part in consolidating them and putting Tenji on the throne. And the Fujiwara coming out of the Nakatomi clan, became the greatest noble clan of classical Japan, ruling for about 500 years. They laid out a new capital, commonly called Nara, okay? And they used the Chinese grid system, okay? They brought that over. And though they originally did not care much for Buddhism, they actually ended up officially accepting Buddhism as the state religion and built temples for Buddhism. These temples have been destroyed. The great temple of the Toriaji Temple in Nara was destroyed twice in 1180 and again in 1567. And then that temple was again rebuilt in 1708. And for a long time, though, it was the largest wooden structure in the entire world. In the 17th century, Buddhism and Shinto had begun to really have an influence on each other, much like we see the influence of Buddhism on Confucianism and Taoism and how they started to work together. But between about 784 and 794, the capital was moved to what was called at the time Heiankyo, which is currently called Kyoto, and which ended up becoming the most densely populated city in the world. And we still have, many cities in Asia still have this problem today. They're so well organized that they allow a lot of people, which isn't necessarily a good thing. One of the things that I love about Oklahoma City, for example, is it sprawls, right? Its population spreads out over such a wide area to avoid this intense packing together. The life and nobility, polygamy was permitted for men. They were allowed to have multiple wives. He could have a full wife and then one or two lesser wives. um, which the various wives lived opposite of each other in the house, so they didn't have to see each other if they really didn't want to, and of course to avoid potential disputes. Um, Men lived very public lives. Women were much more reserved. Okay, they had to hold back, but they were highly educated, um, and a knowledgeable woman, a woman who had the social graces, who had wisdom, who had understanding, who could write, who could read, who could sing, was very prized, um, which is reflected even if you read about some of the various traditions of geisha. It's amazing. Um, Women were, however, great writers. They had excellent calligraphy, and their ability to write mattered, genuinely mattered. So whereas it wasn't public, they could still have influence. Um, we see here Murasaki's poem, okay, uh, written in the hiragana, which gradually replaced the use of Chinese characters and allowed one to spell something out. So more of a system to where you could spell a word as opposed to have to use a symbol to indicate the entire word. Um, and this became more and more popular initially among women, but then among men as well. Okay, I'm not going to get too much into the waka. You're probably familiar, of course, with the haiku form 575, the syllables. Okay, so if you want to have fun, if you look up the show Avatar and haiku competition on YouTube, you can have some fun with the 575 meter. um, okay, so the Tale of Genji. Tale of Genji is probably the first novel in any language. It's over 1,000 pages. It's a long form story. Um, I'm not going to get too much into the details of it, but it would be hundreds of years before we would have something equivalent in the English language or any Western language to the novel. I mean, the first novel in the English language is probably written by Daniel Defoe in the 1700s, and with Murasaki, this was 973, so 800 years sooner. That's all. Um, so we look at the different styles of painting at the time, the Yamato-e and the Omna-e. The Yamato-e versus the Chinese Kara-e painting styles. This is a move away from the traditional Chinese styles to one that is more truly Japanese. Okay, the Japanese took a lot from China, and this was a movement back more towards their own culture and heritage. Um, some scholars have suggested that Yamato-e refers more to large-scale landscape paintings on walls, whereas the Omna-e are more women's paintings, which aren't necessarily done by women, but they were made to be shown and displayed in women's spaces. Okay. Um, so during this period, the emperors had come to rely more and more on regional warrior clans, the samurai, or those who serve. Um, and these clans became more and more and more and more powerful until by 1100 they really were one of the major forces in Japanese life and had control over pretty much daily living for a lot of people. Um, these were expressed through alliances, family-based alliances. Okay, um, and of course, this is going to involve eventually warfare between the various clans. Want to see something fun? Go Shiragawa, okay, ascended to the throne, and the Fujiwara became the traditional regent to the emperor, the highest position in the land. But Shirakawa resisted Fujiwara's attempt to really take control of the government, and so the Fujiwara recruited one of the samurai tribes, the Minamoto, to help them stage a coup and to capture the emperor. And we see there on 394, 395 this really incredible image of the fight. They captured him and burned his palace. The samurai at the time, of course, master horsemen. You see the images of it. They were able to shoot from horseback with deadly accuracy. So you would think that would kind of be, hey, we won. No. The clan that was second most powerful at the time, the Taira, defeated the Minamoto, and for the next 20 years, the Taira managed to control the Japanese court with the absent emperor, with the blessing of the absent emperor. But the Minamoto came back, defeated the Taira, and killed virtually every male of the line. So as soon as this war ended, Yoritomo, who had sat out the war initially, got rid of pretty much any samurai, potentially rival samurai in the region, including his own brother. This rather brutal. And established his rule at Kamakura, removing the influence of a lot of the aristocracy and the priests from Nara. He didn't, interestingly enough, try to assume the throne himself. Okay, instead he ruled at the will of the emperor, which really he controlled. But he never tried to take it on himself. But the emperor did grant him the title of Seitai Shogun, or the barbarian subduing general. So he was basically made the head of all samurai. And they ruled the country for the next century and a half. He would hand out awards of land to the samurai that were loyal to him, the daimyo, or the great name. And the codes of the samurai eventually became much like we talk about the chivalric notions of knighthood in the West. They also had a code of how to act and how to behave called the Code of Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior. Okay, Africa. So we have, during this time, many tribes in Africa were also creating large kingdoms. In West Africa, North Africa, and we see again the influence of Islam on Africa, especially. 396 talking about Ife culture, right? Very highly naturalistic sculptural patterns in clay and stone in their artwork. We see the head of the king there on 397. They show the small holes on scalp lines suggest hair or perhaps a veil of some sort on the head. But the head represents, of course, the king's capacity to organize the world, to be in control. Okay. The Yoruba and the Yoruba origin myths, right? The world of the living, the Aye, and the realm of the gods, the Orun. And the gods themselves are the Orisha. So, and then you have the primal deities who create the world as well as the force of nature, like thunder and lightning, and then ancestral heroes. So all of these different things, all of these can be considered divine and can be considered worthy of worship. Okay. All right. Let's about the Benin, you look there on 398, and the Benin city. This was a city that the British. This is a drawing of it by the British in 1891. Over 2,500 square miles of walls and moats that made up this city. Just an incredible engineering accomplishment of earthworks that I don't know if it's ever quite been paralleled in the same way. There have been great earthworks, but that extensive throughout a culture is just astonishing. Okay? Um, so, about 1170, Benin asked the Oni of Ife to provide a new ruler, which was plagued by misfortune. Just things were not going well. Um, and so he sent Prince Oramian, who founded the dynasty, and he actually named his new territory Land of Vexation because there were so many problems. Um, so he returned home, but he did impregnate the Benin princess and their son Iwuka, who would become the first king of Benin culture. Um, and this is where we end up with 10,000 miles, or 4 to 5 times the length of the Great Wall of China in these earthworks. Um, just a truly amazing accomplishment. Um, Benin culture, we have the praise poems, which are a major part of West African culture. And it was believed that by praising it, you gain some power over it, right? Um, and so you praise something, you praise it, which seems nice, but actually you're attempting to move, to not just move, but to also control what you're praising. Um, One of the things that we see in African culture, and this is actually has carried over into African American rhetoric. If you ever study African American rhetoric, you will see examination of this. Is the call and song, in which somebody says something, and then the group responds back to it. Kind of the one of the things you can think about in church, for example. Can I get an amen? The whole congregation, amen, right? Saying something, and then getting the people to speak back. This goes all the way back to West Africa as a tradition. Um, the other thing you see is the talking drums, which indicate the three tones of the three ways of speaking. And again, we see this oftentimes, this idea of threes, again, repeated in African American rhetoric. Um, we will not stop, we will not fall, we will not falter, right? A lot of times, if you think about the way that things are spoken in groups of three, okay? Well, other cultures do use it. It's very involved in African American culture, and it goes back to Africa itself as part of the tradition. Um, One of the greatest dynasties of cultural importance was actually relatively short, the Zagwe dynasty, about 150 years. And if you look at some of the work that they did, it's just astonishing. Look at the church on page 400. Okay, there in the upper left-hand corner. In order to build this church, they dug down through rock. Okay, they had to have the whole thing mentally created. They had to have the whole thing created and drawn out, and then they dug it out of the ground. How crazy is that? Just astonishing. For me, this is one of the greatest feats of architecture, as you literally carve a building out of the ground beneath you. Not just any building, but something that beautiful that can be used. Is just amazing. Okay. Let's see here. The Swahili Coast. The Swahili Coast, we see an influx of Christianity. And the literal creation of a new language, Swahili, which is an African language blended with Arabic. It's a crazy language. Oh my gosh. And the Swahili were known for their architecture. They would, their mosques were just unbelievably beautiful. They were well thought through. They create such incredible designs and detail. Excuse me. Um, okay. Many of the people of this background, the Swahili background, embraced Islam. Um, we see in Greater Zimbabwe uh, the Shona people who would rely on mining and animal husbandry and agriculture. But as this became more and more a center of trade, they became merchants and became this hub of trade. Positioned on that coast, right? You've got Asia to one side, Africa to the other. So the goods from the inner part of Africa coming to the coast and moving out to Asia, and goods from Asia coming into to their to the Shona's ports, and then coming into the inner Africa. Um, for its time and location, it was a large city, about the Great Zimbabwe, or Palaces of Stone. About 10 to 20,000 people, which again, for time and location, this was a huge city. Um, okay. All right. And now Mesoamerica and South America. Um, we have these cultures, the pre-Columbian cultures, and by pre-Columbian, what we mean is before Columbus, before that horrible, 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 horrible human being who slaver, who was imprisoned in his own time for crimes against humanity, who would impale children, who would allow children to be raped by his men, who would require uh, tribute, and if a person couldn't provide tribute, he would chop off their hands. I mean, Columbus was just a disaster. Okay, so that's what pre-Columbian means. Sorry, I got off on a rant. Um, so we have the three great cultures in Mesoamerica during the Classic era: the Zapotec in Oxay, um, the civilization centered in Tenoctuan, just north of present-day Mexico City, and the Maya in the Yucatan and the Chiapas. Uh, so these were highly developed cultures. They had two calendars, a 260-day ritual calendar, a 365-day solar calendar. The 260-day calendar probably based on the amount of time it took a woman to give birth. And the 365-day calendar, of course, like we do, based on the time it takes the Earth to whip around the sun. Okay? Um, Despite the fact that they never used the wheel, other than children's toys, they didn't figure out how to process bronze or iron. They still managed to move stones that weighed over 100 tons, which you're just sitting there going, how in the world? How? How do you even start? Um, okay, so let's start with the Zapotec. Jade, one of the most treasured possessions of this culture, and of all of Mesoamerica, from the Olmecs to the Aztecs. It symbolized water, it symbolized fertility, um, and vegetation. It's really about life. Um, Teotihuacan, um, unlike Mayan cities, this city remained a holy site for a long time. Even 1,000 years after it flourished, its high point, it was still considered a holy site, and it was visited by rulers. Um, we don't know what the original people called it, um, but it was named by the Aztecs Aztec, which means the place where the gods were created. Much like we talk about the Chinese cities, it was laid out on a grid system. It makes sense, right? Grid systems just make sense. Um, and you have the broad avenue, the Avenue of the Dead, which runs through the city. The two great pyramids, pyramids of the moon and the sun, surrounded by smaller pyramids, um, and about 2,000 apartment complexes. And just think about how many people, especially for the time. Now, imagine trying to build that without without bronze or without iron, without the wheel. Building these types of complexes, just really astounding. Um, uh, uh, at its height, about 200,000 people lived in the city, making it one of the biggest cities in the entire world at the time. Um, it had a Cludadela, a Spanish fortified city center, and a sunken plaza, which was about 17 acres. Uh, and this sunken area could seat about 60,000 people. And when it flooded, it would reflect the images of the city into itself, um, kind of reflecting life and death in a lot of ways. Um, so, we have the Mayas. The Mayans, unlike other cultures in the area, never really centralized around a single culture or around a single ruler or a single government entity. That there were a lot of small little kingdoms that often fought against each other. Um, we talked about the calendar already, the 260-day calendar, the 365-day calendar, and it took 52 years for a given day to repeat itself between the two calendars. The Mayans had two different ways of writing numbers, dots and bars as one, and a set of pictorial numbers, um, or glyphs. Okay. Also, they had zero before even the Mayans had zero before even the Arabs did. So again, mathematics was an advanced concept for this culture. Um, excuse me, I'm sorry. Um, we have the Popol Vuh, a Mayan book of creation written in Quiche, a Mayan dialect that's still spoken actually. It's one that has not yet passed on, um, and it was reproduced between 1554 and 1558 by a Guatemalan native. And even though it was reproduced at that late date, it probably represents beliefs held for 1,000 years. Um, and then Francisco Ximenez copied it and added a Spanish translation. Um, so in their culture, Mayan gods tried three times to create mankind, once from animals, once from mud, and once from wood. Wood is the most successful, though they die as well. And their descendants become monkeys. Um, and the rest of it describes the part one and part two with the two sets of twins, the hero and the monkey twins. Um, and both sets of twins are ball players, and the ball playing game is important to know about because it's literally a matter of life and death for this culture. Um, when people would play the game, and imagine a game of basketball, a combination of basketball and soccer. You have a hoop on the wall, but rather than this way, it's turned this way. So you've got to get into the side. You can use, you can't hold the ball, but you can bounce it off your head. It's a large rubber ball. You can use your feet, you can use your thighs, you can use your elbows, and try to get it. I'm sorry, heads, thighs, or knees that are padded, and to try to get the ball through. And the game would go on for days. And part of the reason it would go on for days is if you lost, you died. You became part of the ritual sacrifice. And your head would be displayed for all to see because you would have let down the gods in losing the game. So, yeah, don't lose. You think it's bad losing a basketball game? Whew. Okay, so post-classic we have the Toltecs and the Aztecs. Toltecs were the bridge between Teotihuacan and the Aztecs. Um, uh, and then blood sacrifice was very crucial to the Aztec culture, which really refer back to the warrior traditions. Aztec believed that the sun, moon, and earth all depended on human blood for its substance. So if you didn't sacrifice a victim, um, the sun could actually go out. So at puberty, boys were placed under the jurisdiction of a local warrior house and trained for war, where they learned that success equaled capturing live victims. You needed to capture them alive because the gods wanted fresh blood, which of course ended up working against them when the Spanish and other colonizing cultures came along because the Spanish were playing around. They would just kill you, as opposed to the Aztecs felt you had to capture your opponents alive. Um, their weapons were designed to aid them in live capture. Ba-da-ba-bum. Okay, the Mochi culture flourished from about 200 BCE to about 800 CE, and then about 800 CE they just kind of vanished, largely in all probability due to weather events related to El Nino. Um, and so there was a political vacuum until about 1300 when the Inca culture emerged. And the Incas used llamas, alpacas, etc., to really kind of take control. They became, since there wasn't any use of the wheel, they used these to haul uh, goods. They were very big into textiles and cloths. Um, they were also extremely good masons, extraordinary masons, for lacking sophisticated tools. You look there on 411, they were able to fit these uh, rocks together so you can't even get the blade of a knife in between them with not with tools that we would be shocked to use now. Um, they also created an extraordinary city of Rhodes that extended about 15,000 miles, which you think about how incredible that is. This was probably the closest thing to on par to the roads of Rome for the time, with about 1,000 lodgings along these roads, with so places to sleep that were safe. Um, the llamas were also a source of wool, which in addition to hauling, so again, coming back to the idea of textiles. Um, yep. Okay. So make sure you get your discussion boards done, and I will get the next lecture posted here shortly. Have a good one.